First of all, I want to say how grateful I am to be here in this beautiful country. You must know how blessed you are to be in such a beautiful land. And it's always nice to come here to Italy. As Ugo said, we do this conference in Italy, and then we go up into Germany. And I went on a mission in Germany and Switzerland, and sometimes I think, how can you compete with Italy, because it's so beautiful here with the landscape and the castles and the older buildings and the churches. It's just really nice. But today my talk is on Freemasonry and the temple. And before I get into my topic, I want to tell a short story. And imagine, just for a moment, that you're back to being very young and unmarried, maybe 18, 19 years old, and you want to go out on a date. And you're going to go out on a date with someone you've never been on a date with before. And so you have new clothes. Maybe if you're one of the ladies, you have a brand new dress you've been looking forward to putting on, and you put that on. Young men, you put on a nice shirt and pants. And you go downstairs, and your parents say, "Wow, you look really good." And you go to the door, and your date's at the door, and your date says, "Oh, you look fabulous. You look so good. You look beautiful." Or handsome, if you're a young man. And about this time, you're feeling pretty good. And maybe you go to a restaurant, and you're there, and a couple of friends from school come by, and they say, "You look fabulous tonight. You look really good." And this time, you're feeling really good. And then someone walks by and leans over and whispers in your ear, "Why would you wear that? That looks terrible on you. It just makes you look fat." Now, when you go home that night, are you going to think about all the nice comments you got and how well the date went? Or are you going to think about that one comment, that one negative comment by the person that you might not even know? And which one are you going to focus on? And that's the way it is with a lot of criticisms of the church. You hear the criticism, and you focus on that one criticism, and you forget about all the wonderful things and all the great blessings that comes from the gospel, but you just focus on that one negative thing. And that's how the Masonry topic sometimes is. It's one thing people focus on sometimes, and they use it they use the topic to try to discredit Joseph Smith and the entire church. And my feeling, I'll tell you right up front, is they really can't do that. It just doesn't work. And I'll even tell you the two basic arguments with Masonry and the temple. Argument number one is that Masons are bad. And Joseph Smith copied the Masons and put it in the temple ceremony. Therefore, Joseph Smith and Mormons are bad. That's argument number one. Argument number two is Masons used to think they're an ancient tradition. We now know they're modern, and their rituals were just made up. Somebody made it up. Joseph Smith did not recognize the ritual was just made up. Therefore, he was not a prophet, and we can dismiss everything with Mormonism. So those are the two basic arguments you can think about as I go into my talk. Now, the first, as more temples are built around the world, some of these questions come up from the members. What does this have to do with Masonry? I've heard something, or I heard something on the internet. And I have kind of a problem in talking about this subject. And just to get an idea, by show of hands, please raise your hand, how many of you in this room are both a Master Mason and have gone to the temple ceremony already? Nobody. So that's why using this as an argument against the church is so effective. Because the Masons have a policy of not talking about it. The Mormons have a policy of not talking about it. And so if someone just makes an accusation, the accusation sits unanswered, and nobody talks about it, and nobody knows whether the answer is true or not true, or the criticism is true or not true. And so it makes it a little difficult. So to help with this, I'm going to go back to the very beginning and explain some history. And we'll start with the Masons, and then we'll talk about the LDS and bring the two together a little bit. So Freemasonry has been around a long time. It's been the subject of over 50,000 books, pamphlets, and articles since it came into the world or revealed itself to the world in 1717. There is so much written on it, it would be impossible to cover it all in the time I have, but I'm going to try to get the main points across to you. Freemasonry is one of the world's oldest and largest non-religious, non-political, fraternal, and charitable organizations. It has about 4 million members worldwide. Its members are expected to be of high moral standing and are encouraged to speak openly about their membership in Freemasonry. Only men are allowed to be Masons, so it's a men-only group. And they meet together in a group known as a lodge. So the organization teaches moral and social virtues through participation in a series of ritual dramas. These dramas are a progression of plays which are memorized and performed within each lodge. They use stonemasons' customs and tools as allegorical guides and are believed by many to follow ancient rituals. The ceremonies demand a high degree of personal involvement. For example, one of the ceremonies dramatizes the murder of a man named Hiram Abiff, who is claimed to be the architect of Solomon's Temple. In this dramatization, if you were the initiate, you would be playing the part of Hiram Abiff. So you would be the person who gets murdered. So you don't have a lot of speaking lines with that, which is good. So the Freemasons use this active participation to reinforce learning. There's been a lot of educational research done which supports the Freemasons' claim that involving someone physically in events using drama helps people understand and remember the concepts being taught. One professor at my college teaches memory techniques. Part of what he teaches is how using body movement helps us interact with the material and remember it better. Freemasonry instills in its members a moral and ethical approach to life. Its values are based on integrity, kindness, honesty, and fairness. Freemasonry teaches concern for all people, care for the less fortunate, and help for those in need. They have traditionally cared for widows and orphans and engaged in acts of charity. These activities are very important historically, as government aid for the poor did not exist until fairly recently. Mozart's widow was one of the most famous to receive such charity. In modern times, they still participate in many acts of charity, such as funding children's hospitals. It's not a religion. Masons make no claims to helping people obtain salvation. They accept members of every faith, including Hindus, Muslim, anything. Just the only requirement to being a Mason is that you must believe in God. No Masons, no atheists can be a Mason. Freemasons are supporters of law and order and have members who are considered people of high standing in the community. Notable Masons include several of the founding fathers of the United States, such as George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Many of the ideas of equal rights, elections, majority rule that are found in constitutions in many countries can be traced back to Masonic beliefs and customs. Other famous Freemasons include nobility of Great Britain, the German emperors Wilhelm I and Frederick III, as well as nobility and government leaders of many European countries. Now, I understand that when we talk about people of high moral character and we talk about government leaders of many countries, those two things don't always go together. I get that. But in theory, that's the way it's supposed to be. So with that short description of this altruistic and law-abiding group, why would anyone think there's a problem? Why are people concerned about the Freemasons? And how does that relate to Mormonism? And why are there so many books Da Vinci Code with Dan Brown, and Angels and Demons that all involve Masonry. Well, the first problem people have with Freemasonry is the insistence on secrecy. Even Joseph Smith commented, the secret of Masonry is to keep a secret. While Freemasons are open about who belongs to the group, they make promises not to reveal the ceremonies that occur within Masonry. The reason, in my opinion, they keep it secret is because they want everyone to experience for themselves the rituals and learn it. They don't want you to read it first and go. That would be like being invited to a surprise party, or being invited to your own surprise party and say, on Tuesday we're having a surprise party for you, and Farella Perego is going to come, and somebody, Jack is going to be there, and Fred's going to be there. That's not a surprise, and you wouldn't have those same feelings that you have by just experiencing it yourself. So what they want to say is, don't tell anybody what happens so that they can have the experience for themselves. You can read many of the rituals yourself in Masonic libraries. This book was written in 1866. It's called Duncan's Ritual of Freemasonry. But again, Masons believe the lessons learned through the rituals are best understood when personally experienced. The Masons have instances in their ceremonies where they remind the initiates about the importance of secrecy. These have typically been described as what terrible thing you would rather have done to yourself than to share this secret. I remember as a child making a promise of secrecy. I won't tell that secret. And then I would say, and this was very typical, good American children, we'd say, cross my heart and hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. I'm not going to tell a secret. I don't know if they have similar things in Italian or not, but that's what we would say. Now, this gruesome child rhyme is very similar to the type of oaths within historic Masonry. Many opponents of Masonry, however, have claimed that these oaths are not oaths of secrecy, but oaths of vengeance and calls to violence. The second problem some people have with Freemasonry is its relationship with religion. There is no salvation in Freemasonry, and it is not a religion. They accept members of all faiths. They encourage members to go to church, but with an emphasis on morality and a belief in God. Some have argued that Masonry is a pseudo-religion, and since it does not include Christ, it is evil. The Catholic Church has a particularly antagonistic relationship with Masonry. In the 18th century, there were condemnations by Pope Clement the 12th in 1738 and Pope Benedict the 14th in 1751. In addition, there was a condemnation given by Cardinal Giuseppe Ferraio, Secretary of State for the Papal States in 1739. These condemnations cite the secrecy with which the Masons surround themselves, the oaths they swear, and suspicion of acting against the peace and good order of society. It is fairly certain that the Pope also suspected them of heresy due to their meetings where both Catholics and non-Catholics met together, which at the time was punishable by excommunication. It's not known for sure, but it's possible the first papal condemnation in 1738 came about partially because of the actions of Andrew Michael Ramsay. He was a knight who worked for the deposed King of England. He moved to France and tried to get people involved in Freemasonry. The French didn't seem interested in the group that focused around the work of stonecutters. Can you imagine the French? You're trying to start a group and they say, what do we do? Well, we're stonecutters. Well, I'm not a stonecutter. Well, we use these tools for stories. No, I'm not going to do that. So he made a famous speech which gave an entirely new history for Masonry. He put forward the claim that Masonry was not born of stonecutters in Scotland, which was what had been said before. But the origins came through the Crusaders in the Holy Land that made vows with the Knights of St. John to restore the temple to the Christians. And suddenly there was a great interest in Masonry. It was alleged at the time, and many believe today, that the Knights Templar, many of whom were imprisoned and excommunicated from the Catholic Church on Friday the 13th, 1307, found sanctuary with the Freemasons in Scotland. And it was further alleged that the Templars shared the secrets of the Temple Mount with the Masons. And this narrative creates the tie that the Masons have with the Templar Knights that we see in many of the books and movies today. Allegedly, the Masons also offered sanctuary to some of the early Protestant reformers, which certainly would not have made the Catholic Church very happy. In Italy, I think you recognize these names, maybe. In Italy in the late 1800s, there was a nationalist movement which sought to take the secular power from the Catholic Church. Two leaders of the nationalist movement, Camillo Benso, Count of Corvara, and Giuseppe Garibaldi, were both Freemasons. So the Pope put out a string of papal bulls condemning Masonry in the hope of weakening these two men and retaining the Catholic Church's secular power in Italy. In modern times, an Italian Masonic lodge named Propaganda Due was involved in several scandals. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing the Italian at least sort of close, probably not, but hopefully. Had its charter revoked in 1976. However, the lodge continued to operate, but as a group not affiliated with the legitimate Ground Lodge of Italy. Many high government officials belonged to this pseudo-Masonic lodge. During the years the lodge was headed by this man, Licio Gelli, members of this lodge were implicated in numerous crimes, including the collapse of the Vatican-affiliated Banco Ambrosiano, the murders of journalist Mino Pecorelli and bankers Roberto Calvi, and in corruption cases within the national bribe scandal Tangentopoli. So the Grand Oriente d'Italia, the Masonic Grand Lodge of Italy, took disciplinary action against the members of this lodge and erased the Propaganda Due lodge from its rolls. They were all excommunicated. They'd already been kicked out before they did this, but then after they did this, they erased their names as if they had never been members of the Masonic Lodge. And they did this because it violated the values of Freemasonry. But from these examples, we can see why there's a historic antagonism between Masons and Catholics, it's especially problematic here in Italy. Among Protestants, there's a mixed view on Masonry. The anti-Masonic rhetoric comes from the fundamentalist evangelical Christians who believe that Freemasons should be regarded as part of an evil organization devoted to the occult. Now, there's no evidence of this at all, but the criticism started in the 1800s and was repeated to this day. In the German countries, there were problems with a non-Masonic group in Bavaria known as the Illuminati. Has anyone here heard of the Illuminati before? Yeah, it's in lots of books and movies. So in 1776, Adam Weishaupt, the dean of the law faculty at the University of Ingolstadt, established the Order of Illuminati and constructed a legendary history. Now, constructed a legendary history is a nice, polite way for saying he made it up. But it traced the origins of the organization back to Persia 1,000 years earlier. But unlike Masonry, which tries to remain non-political, Weishaupt planned to utilize his organization to overthrow the Kingdom of Bavaria and replace the monarchy with a form of republican government. So the crime of the Illuminati is that they were Republicans, or they wanted a republican government. A year later, Weishaupt became a Freemason in Munich, and he began to recruit heavily among the Freemasons for followers. But then in 1784, the group was discovered and banned from Bavaria along with the Masons. The aggressive police measures where they were either arrested or banned and expelled from the country dissolved and eliminated the Illuminati. But rumors persist that the Order of the Illuminati continues to this day, and Illuminati are favorite bad guys for many novelists and many movie writers. In modern times, the Nazis under Adolf Hitler used an 1897 book titled The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This book taught that the Jews secretly controlled the Masons, and the two groups together were working toward world domination. Anti-Semitism became closely tied with anti-Masonry. The irony with this is that the Masons were mostly Christians. There were very, very few Jews among them at that time. The anti-Semitic and anti-Masonic Protocols of the Elders of Zion book was actually a forgery put together by the Russian secret police. Nevertheless, it became a central part of Nazi propaganda, and it's still read in many countries today, especially many of the Middle Eastern countries. When cities were captured by the Nazis, within 24 hours, the SS would burst into Masonic lodges, gather up all the books and the records, and send them to Berlin. The Nazis were hoping to learn the ancient mysteries of the temple, and they believed that the Masons were hiding that from the world. When the Russians then captured Berlin, they captured the Masonic libraries, and they shipped them off to Moscow, also hoping to find the temple secrets the Masons had been hiding from the world. Well, the libraries were not returned until the year 2000, and no great secrets or scandals were discovered in the books at all. They just found out who attended what meeting and who was behind in their dues, and not much. So in America, Freemasonry was very popular for a time, but it fell out of favor in 1826 when a bricklayer named William Morgan threatened to expose the rituals of Freemasonry. He was going to publish a book, and Mr. Morgan suddenly disappeared and was presumed murdered. But his publisher went ahead and published the book anyway. There was a huge public outcry of people who were sure the Masons had killed Mr. Morgan, and maybe they did, we don't know. No one knows for sure. But it actually led to the creation of a political party whose sole purpose was to get rid of Masons. It was called the Anti-Masonic Party. And one of the main writers for that party, he wrote the newspaper for the party, was a man named W.W. Phelps. And he was the journalist for the Anti-Masonic newspaper. And he later joined the church and became a scribe for Joseph Smith, and at one point became the assistant president of the church. The widow, there's W.W. Phelps. The widow of Mr. Morgan, Lucinda Morgan Harris, also joined the church. And some believe she was sealed to Joseph Smith, although the evidence of this is uncertain. This brings us to the connection with the story of the Mormons. The Saints had suffered much, the mobs of far west Missouri. They escaped back east across the river to Illinois, where they built the city of Nauvoo. Joseph Smith was looking for a way to protect the members of the church from their non-Mormon neighbors, and he became interested in Freemasonry. As part of their ceremony, the Masons take an oath to protect and care for each other. And it seemed the perfect solution. The Saints would all become Freemasons, and they would fall under the same protection of their Masonic non-Mormon neighbors. And at the same time, maybe they could learn these ancient rituals of Masonry, which were at the time believed to be from the Temple of Solomon. The Apostle John Woodsoe later wrote that Joseph Smith was initiated into the Masons to foster the spirit of brotherhood and to lessen the mob persecutions to which the church had been subjected in Ohio and Missouri. Ultimately, Joseph's attempt to win sufficient friends through Masonry to stop persecution failed, obviously. It is alleged that Joseph gave the Masonic cry of distress during his martyrdom, and yet his non-Mormon Masonic brothers did nothing to help. And it's likely many of those non-Mormon Masonic brothers were in the mobs that killed Joseph Smith. And this made Brigham Young very angry, and he later said that those Illinois Masons, he said of those Illinois Masons that Joseph and Hiram were put to death by the Masons. And we know he was only referring to those Illinois Masons because Brigham Young retained his Masonic membership even as he went to Utah, but he was very angry at the Masons at that time. So at this point, many LDS members question how Joseph Smith and the Nauvoo Mormons could join Masonry when the Book of Mormon clearly states that secret combinations are of the devil. Masons keep their ceremonies secret. So therefore, they are a secret combination. Isn't that right? Even Martin Harris, who was an anti-Mason himself, he belonged to the Anti-Masonic party too. He took out an advertisement in the local newspaper for the Book of Mormon, and he called it the new Anti-Masonic Bible. So one of our Sunday school guys, forgive me this is in English, but I'll read it. The Guide to the Scriptures defines secret combinations as an organization of people bound together by oaths to carry out the evil purposes of the group. In 2 Nephi 9:9, speaking of the devil, it says, "He stirreth up the children of men unto secret combinations of murder and all manner of secret works of darkness." In conference, Elder Melvin J. Ballard said, "The Book of Mormon teaches that secret combinations engaged in crime present a serious challenge, not just to individuals and families, but to entire civilizations. Among today's secret combinations are gangs, drug cartels, and organized crime families. The secret combinations of our day function much like the Gadianton robbers of Book of Mormon times. They have secret signs and code words. They participate in secret rites and initiation ceremonies. And among their purposes are to murder, plunder, and steal, and commit whoredoms, and all manner of wickedness, contrary to the laws of their country and also the laws of God." So if we compare these prophetic warnings with the Freemasons, they don't really fit the definition of a secret combination. Freemasons as a group do not plan murders. They plan how to fund hospitals. They do not plan to overthrow the government. That would be groups like the Illuminati, who are not Masons, at least not a recognized Masonic group. Freemasons don't plunder, steal, and commit whoredoms. In fact, they teach against those things, and they expel members who engage in those activities. So on December 29th, 1841, the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge was organized. On March 15th, 1842, Joseph Smith was initiated as an apprentice. And then later that month, he was raised to the level of Master Mason. On May 4th of that same year, Joseph introduced the new endowment to 9 men on the second floor of his red brick store. He had the second floor prepared for the event. Now remember, this is before the Nauvoo Temple was built. There were no temples at that time, or the Nauvoo Temple was not there for that time. He had the second floor prepared by hanging canvas tarps and partitioning off the second floor into 5 rooms, representing the creation, the Garden of Eden, the earth after Adam and Eve's expulsion, in the present-day world, and the celestial room. And 9 of Joseph's closest followers were given their endowments there. At the conclusion of the endowment, Joseph told Brigham Young, "It's not arranged right, but we've done the best we could under the circumstances in which we are placed. I wish you," talking to Brigham, "to take this matter in hand and organize and systematize all of these ceremonies with the signs, tokens, penalties, and keywords." Brigham commented, "I did so, and each time I got something more. So that when we went through the temple at Nauvoo, I understood and knew how to place them there. We had our ceremonies pretty correct. Pretty correct." So if Joseph Smith created the temple ceremonies after he was a Mason, did he just copy Freemasonry to create the temple ceremony? to discuss that, let's talk about first what goes on inside of the LDS temple to the extent is appropriate in the setting. And just so you know, I checked, so we're okay. We're okay. The first and most familiar ordinance in the temple is baptism for the dead. Baptisms are performed in a font that rests in the back of 12 oxen. The font is modeled after the basin described in Solomon's temple in 2 Chronicles 4:4, where it talks about standing on 12 oxen with 3 facing each direction. Now, just so you know, a lot of people will say these oxen represent the 12 tribes of Israel, and I hear that in the temple all the time I go. And they do, kind of. I mean, when I was growing up, I thought, oxen, yes, they pulled ox carts, taking the pioneers across the plains. Of course they're oxen. But no, it comes from the Bible, and the Bible describes the oxen. And the ox is the symbol of the tribe of Joseph, Ephraim. And so symbolically, we have Joseph, or Ephraim, going out to the 12 tribes of Israel to bring them back in for salvation. So that would be my interpretation of the oxen. You can interpret it differently if you'd like, but that's how I feel. And that I get that interpretation from Matt Brown and his book, Symbols in Stone. So we do baptism. The second ceremony in the temple is the washing and anointing ceremony, where one is symbolically washed and anointed. This is recorded in the book of Exodus, chapter 40, verses 12 and 13, where it says, "And thou shalt bring Aaron and his sons unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and wash them with water. And thou shalt put upon Aaron the holy garments, and anoint him, and sanctify him, that he may minister unto me in the priest office." The third thing that happens in the temple is the endowment ceremony, where through film or personal dramatization, one symbolically falls from the presence of God, makes covenants to follow God in Jesus Christ, and eventually returns back to the presence of God. Fourth, there is the sealing or marriage ceremony, where couples are sealed to each other and where parents and children are sealed to one another as families for time and all eternity. So how does this compare with Freemasonry? In Freemasonry, there is no baptism. In Freemasonry, there is no confirmation. In Freemasonry, there is no washing and anointing, except for one very obscure rite, one very small group. In Freemasonry, there is no sealing. In Freemasonry, there is no concept of work for the dead. In Freemasonry, there is no salvation through Jesus Christ. Most of what goes on in the temple has no resemblance at all to anything Masonic. There are, however, a few small similarities that I'll go over. Now, many of the early saints who went through the Nauvoo temple were already Freemasons. Remember, Joseph Smith wanted everyone to become a Freemason so they could be protected by their non-Mormon Masonic neighbors. And Freemasons included people like Brigham Young, Willard Richards, William Marks, Hiram Smith, and Heber C. Kimball. They believed that Freemasonry was an apostate form of temple worship from Solomon's temple. So just as they had no problem with Joseph receiving revelation on apostate practices of Christianity, they had no problem with Joseph receiving revelation on how the temple ceremony should be carried out. They didn't seem to believe the temple ceremony was simply borrowed from the Masonic ceremony. They didn't believe that. W. Phelps and Lucinda Morgan Harris, remember them from earlier? Both very strong anti-Masons. And Lucinda had her husband killed over Masonry. They were endowed in the Nauvoo temple, and they had no problems with it. And they did not believe the temple endowment was Masonry. After the temple ceremonies were performed in Nauvoo, the Masonic Lodge continued to operate. The other church members, who were also Masons, did not feel the temple replaced Masonry. They didn't believe it was the same. Even anti-Mormon writer Fanny Stenhouse wrote, "It's always been commonly reported, and to a great extent believed, that the mysteries of the endowment house were only a sort of initiation of the rites of Masonry. But I need hardly say that this statement, when examined by the light of facts, is altogether ungrounded and absurd." So if the Mormons and the anti-Mormons both believe who were familiar with both ceremonies, this is a group that knew the Mason ceremony and knew the temple ceremony, and they didn't believe there was a connection, the temple was Masonic, why does the question of connection still exist today? It exists because there are a few similarities between the Masonic rituals and a few of the phrases and actions used in the endowment ceremony. Additionally, there are a few Masonic-like symbols on the outside of the Salt Lake Temple. So let's talk about the similarities. And we'll first talk about the symbols on the Salt Lake Temple. Before the Salt Lake Temple was built, Brigham Young sent architects all over Europe to look at the many great cathedrals. We have beautiful cathedrals here, don't we? We have domos, we have lots of beautiful things. And the architects looked at those first before they built the Salt Lake Temple. I was just talking to one of the YSA members yesterday, and she was commenting on all the many symbols on the Catholic Church in her town that were like Masonic symbols. But it's likely that they got many of the ideas to design these symbols from here in Europe. And Matthew Brown goes further in his book, Symbols in Stone, and he comments that Joseph Smith talked about many of these symbols even before he was involved in Masonry. So many of these symbols have deep roots in Western Christian culture. And we can find things like handshakes, stars, pentagrams, the all-seeing eye. There's one large anti-Mormon website, and it claims the phrase, "Holiness to the Lord," which we find on all the temples, has been copied from the Masons, because the Masons also have that phrase in some of their buildings. But that phrase occurs several times in the Bible, always in connection with temples. So I think it's much more likely the Bible, or God, was a source for that phrase than the Masons. It's much more likely. So let's talk about the ceremonial similarities. The temple endowment ceremony is presented as a ritualistic drama. The Masonic ceremonies are presented as a ritualistic drama. So in that general form, they're similar. The endowment ceremony starts with the creation in the Garden of Eden and moves us into God's presence. The Masonic ceremony focuses on the murder of the architect of Solomon's temple, so they're not similar at all there. Now, there's some critics who have written, aha, there's the Garden of Eden in the Mormon temple ceremony, and there's one group in France of women who existed in the 1700s, a small top-secret Masonic group that existed just for a little while, when they had some women Masons, they experimented with women Masons. And they too had a Garden of Eden in their ceremonies. Therefore, Joseph Smith must have copied from them. But I think there's a much more likely source of the story of the Garden of Eden than a top-secret group in France that Joseph might have been familiar with. I mean, it's called the Bible. There are some short words and phrases, or some short word phrases and tokens of covenants used in the temple ceremony that are similar to word phrases and tokens of promises used in Masonry. But the Masonic word phrases and tokens are not related to the themes, teachings, or covenants made in the temple. It's also interesting to note that the similar short phrases used in the temple that are similar are not critical phrases in the endowment ceremony. They're more process words that are the same. Now, when the endowment ceremony was first done in Nauvoo, it was much longer. And as the endowment ceremony has been shortened, it's been interesting because it's the Masonic-like phrases that have been almost entirely cut. There's hardly anything that's similar at all now in the temple ceremony. Now, Catholic scholar, I should say, Italian Catholic scholar, Massimo Introvigini, is that how you pronounce it, I think? So, he writes, Introvigna, okay, Introvigna. He writes, anti-Mormons often read too much into similarities between the endowment and Masonic ritual. So here's a Catholic saying, it's really not there. He goes on to say, Smith used Masonic language of rituals for the purpose of confirming his followers familiar with Freemasonry into a doctrine which had no similarities with anything they heard in a Masonic lodge. Now, Masonic rites confer a series of degrees upon individuals. The three basic degrees are entered apprentice, fellow craft, master mason. Those three levels are put together in something known as the Blue Lodge, and that's basic masonry, Blue Lodge masonry. As the initiate makes promises, he shakes hands or performs other physical movements to signify this agreement. Now, if you think about it, in our culture, there are a number of ways to represent making promises or covenants. These include signing your name on a piece of paper, shaking hands, raising your right hand to the square, being immersed in water, eating bread and water or bread and wine, or even, in the American TV cowboy custom, spitting on your hand and then shaking hands for promise. I mean, I think some of the youth today in America, they'll say, do you swear? Yes, I pinky swear. And they do this. Those are little fingers, pinky swear. But in each case, these physical actions show that it is a token showing you're making a promise. Now, throughout time, God has also used various methods or signs to represent the making of covenants. In Genesis 17:11, it talks about circumcision being a token of the covenant. In Genesis 9:12, he talks about the rainbow being a token of the covenant. In Exodus 12:13, he talks about the blood on the posts being a token of the covenant. And in the Book of Mormon, when Captain Moroni asked people to follow God, they rend their garments in token of the covenant. So a token is a physical action that God asks us to do as we make a promise. And again, remember, we make tokens of covenants every day in our life as we sign our names. That's a token of covenants. That's a token. Now, if we remember back in 2 Kings, there was a man named Naaman. And Naaman was asked to wash in the River Jordan 7 times as a token of his humility. Now, we all know the River Jordan did not cure his leprosy. We know that. But God was able to cure the leprosy after Naaman did the physical action showing his humility before God. Whatever physical action is we do, the important thing to remember, it's the covenant or the promise that we make that's important, not necessarily how we symbolize that promise. Now, I will make one exception comment, and that's we have to remember that sometime God asks us to make the token of our covenant in a certain way, just like Naaman was told, you wash in the river 7 times, and God told him that. And so we shouldn't just discount or dismiss the tokens God has given us, but we have to recognize that it's not the token that's important, it's the covenant that's important, other than God told us to do a certain way. That's the only reason it's important. Now, there are other optional degrees in Masonry. There's only 3 degrees in basic Masonry, but there's 33 optional degrees you can do. And they're organized into 2 groups. One's called the York Rite, one's called the Scottish Rite, and one of the ceremonies on these 33 degrees, one of the ceremonies of the York Rite is called the Royal Arch Degree. And I bring that up because our critics bring that one up, because of the similarities between the Royal Arch degree and our temple endowment. And the Royal Arch degree involves people wearing priestly robes, and they pass through a veil to go into a Holy of Holies. And our critics say, see, that's where Joseph Smith got it. He got it from the Royal Arch degree. Well, the only problem is that Joseph was not a Royal Arch degree initiate. He was a Blue Lodge Mason and never did those optional degrees. Okay, so he knew a couple of people who were Royal Arch Masons. There were 2 or 3 in Nauvoo. One was Newell K. Whitney. He was a Royal Arch Mason. But passing through the veil, Holy of Holies, wearing sacred clothing, I've read that somewhere before, not in Masonry. Oh yeah, that's all in the Bible. So I would think it's much more likely Joseph Smith would have gotten those things from the Bible than from this Masonic ceremony that he probably wasn't even familiar with. Another similarity, both Masons in their lodge and Mormons in their temple ceremony use aprons. But the aprons are very different and have very different meanings. Our aprons are made out of green cloth. Their aprons are made out of white lambskin. Has to be, in their tradition, it has to be white lambskin. Our aprons represent the fig leaves sewn together to cover their nakedness. Their aprons represent something to cover the Masons from dust as they work on the stones. So totally different meanings. Now, early saints believed that both Freemasonry and the temple endowment came from ancient temple rituals. Hugh Nibley, Matt Brown, and Jeff Bradshaw have done a lot of work showing ties between what is done in modern temples and ancient temples. And some of it's very good. Our modern temples seem to match the theme of the ancient temples, symbolically moving people back to the presence of God. While it's not the primary purpose of Masonic rituals, it is possible that some aspects of Masonic rites were fashioned after ancient temple themes. But there's still much disagreement over whether Masonic rituals are ancient or modern. Historians of Joseph Smith's day believe they were all ancient. The saints in Nauvoo believed they were ancient. Historians today, most of them believe they were modern. But in the modern creation, they tapped into some ancient traditions. So quite honestly, when was Masonry started? Where did the rituals come from? I've read a number of books by some very prominent historians of Masonry, and they all say the same thing. We don't know. Nobody knows. The records are gone. We don't know where Masonry came from. We do know there's records that date back to about 1300. And from 1700 forward, we have better records, but otherwise nobody knows. So lastly, in the temple, we make covenants to follow God. Greg Kearney, a master Mason and good Latter-day Saint, pointed out, the endowment is revealed doctrine necessary for the salvation of the saints. It teaches us God's relationship to man, our duties, and our responsibilities. He clarifies we have the endowment, which is the message, and we have the ritual of the endowment, which is the messenger. The ritual has changed from time to time, while the endowment has not. If you think about it like a baptismal service, we have a baptism where we make our covenants, and we have a baptismal service where we have 2 talks, 2 prayers, and a hymn, and maybe a musical number. If we change the hymn, or we put both talks in front of the baptism, or one before and one after, or both after, it really doesn't matter. The important thing is the baptismal service, the ordinance, the time of making covenants. So did Joseph Smith use some words and symbols from Masonry to create the temple ceremony? Possibly. I would say probably yes. But only a very small amount. And only things that were form and not substance. In other words, only transitional words, not not the covenants. No covenants. So did Masons use words and symbols from Solomon's temple to create their Masonic ceremonies? Or is Masonry purely a 17th century creation? Nobody knows. But it doesn't matter, because the claim that Joseph Smith borrowed the entire temple ceremony from Masonry, whether created in the 17th century or anciently, is clearly false. While there are a few similarities, the entire purpose and intent is different. Instead of believing that Joseph Smith copied the ceremony from the Masons, it makes much more sense to say that Joseph Smith got the temple ceremony from God. And maybe some from the Bible? I don't know. Directly from God, from the Bible, same thing. And Masonry, got it from the Bible. Did they get it from Solomon's temple? I don't know, maybe. I have personally witnessed the influence and miracles of God within the walls of the temple, and the power that keeping the covenants that we make there has had in my life. The temple creates a sacred space where we can worship God. And as we participate in temple ordinances, we set ourselves on the path to return to Him, blessing our lives and blessing our families. And I say this in Jesus' name, amen.